Hey everyone, so if you haven't guessed already from the title especially, this is like a 1920s inspired video. It's not so much me doing a bang on 1920s look because I wanted to incorporate more modern elements into it, so it's just really inspired and maybe kind of a way in which you can wear, you know, elements from the 1920s. Obviously the Great Gatsby is out. I haven't even seen it yet, but that seems to have had such a huge influence on people beauty wise at the moment and recently, so everyone's been asking for it, so I decided I'd do one. I actually had a face chart that I found from I think it's about 3 years ago, if you can see that there. This is it was like a 1920s flapper inspired face chart that I did ages ago. I worked roughly off that, like I changed some of the shapes and some of the elements and colour. I still stayed close enough to it, and I'll explain throughout the video as well how the different features maybe were treated in the 1920s and just what I'm doing now to incorporate that into today's look. But I hope you enjoy this, guys. Of course there'll be a full list of ingredients, I keep saying that, a list of products on LetzMakeup as usual, so there'll be a link to that below, and in the meantime just keep watching for the tutorial. Alright guys, so hi, ignore my fluffy hair, I wasn't long out of the shower. But first of all, before applying any makeup, I had moisturised quite intensely and I curled my lashes as well. The eyelash curlers were actually invented in the 1920s, which I thought was very interesting. But because I'm using the Illamasqua Skin Base Foundation, which I still am struggling with a little bit to get to work maybe to its optimum level, I have to use quite a moussey primer underneath so that it doesn't fall into my pores, so that's what I had to do. I used that Bourjois primer, and then I used mostly the Skin Base Foundation in SB03, which is the palest one of the like yellow tone, and I popped a little bit of this on the back of my hand along with a tiny bit of SB02, which is a lighter pink colour, just to lighten it up a little bit, because skin back in the 1920s, particularly in the first half of the decade, was worn quite pale. It wasn't until the second half of the 1920s when tanning oil was invented that, you know, a darker skin tone and tan was favoured. So it's even in the 1920s that a fascination with black culture in general and in media and in beauty and in the beauty world and all that became to the forefront. So I did keep my skin nice and light here. I buffed it in with that duo fibre brush you saw here, and then because it's quite a full coverage foundation, it really makes my eyes look really dark when I pop it on, so I need to use quite a brightening concealer on my eyes. I used the Maybelline one in the lighter shade, which was 15. I think there's a 10, but this is a light kind of pink shade, and I used kind of 3 fingers to buff it in. I applied it with my ring finger. I used my pointer finger then to kind of spread it out, and the middle finger to remove any excess and really just melt it into place. And then any excess that was left on my fingers, I just applied this to my nose and my chin and anywhere else where I'd want a little bit of a highlight. So for my initial first eye colour, I used the Illamasqua Hollow Pigment or Cream Pigment, and I applied this again using my fingers and just put it all over my eyelid, particularly concentrating on that inner corner and working it up into the eyebrow. And using a cotton bud, I applied some of the same cream pigment right up into my lower lash lines, right up into the lash bed. Highlights back in the 1920s really were just created by using Vaseline on the skin, but here I'm using a matte white kind of creamy eyeshadow by Inglash number 351. I'm applying this to the brow bone. I don't want obviously to use Vaseline because we know that that just doesn't really last too long nowadays when we've better things to choose from. And then I'm using number 390, another matte Inglash eyeshadow. This is a slightly darker taupe kind of colour, and I'm just using this to start building up that shadow on the eye. And again, I'm concentrating this on that inner corner right up against the bridge of my nose and my eyebrow, and I'm also working this under the eye a tiny bit. Next, moving on to a smaller eyeshadow brush, I'm just applying some of this same eyeshadow right up under my lashes again where I applied the cream pigment. And then using MAC's Quarry eyeshadow, which is a slightly deeper kind of violet taupe colour. Again, it's matte. I applied this to the moving part of my lid. I'm careful not to apply this too far above my crease though. I want that kind of large puppy dog-eyed kind of sullen look that the actresses, the silent movie actresses had of the 1920s, which is quite different, I suppose, from the cat-eyed, lifted eye looks that we would favour today. I then moved on to another slightly deeper but similar eyeshadow. This is Copper Plate again by MAC, and I worked this again into the inner corner, trying to intensify that area and really create that kind of shadow that you would have there anyhow. It's very kind of film noir, reminds me of that aesthetic that Illamasqua has as well. And I worked this again slightly into the crease, but not really over the crease, and up into the eyebrows. And then it was more of a white or a light colour that they used to apply to the inner corner of the eyes because everything was about making the eyes big back in the 1920s. But I wanted to make this a bit more modern, and because I have quite large eyes, I decided to put in a black kohl pencil instead. And then using an almost black but not totally carbon black eyeshadow, this is Typographic by MAC again, I started to press this into the lash bed all around my eyes. This was something that was quite prevalent in the 1920s, where they would get kohl, or rather a black grease pencil, and then they would smudge this all around the lash bed to kind of give the illusion of a bigger eye as well and more defined lashes. And I also applied a tiny bit of the Typographic to the very inner corner to add a little bit more depth. Eyebrows back in the 1920s were plucked extremely thin, which is something that I can't really emulate anymore, but you can still kind of get the shape. So they had very dark eyebrows, which I'm not going to go for, but something that was very noticeable was the extremely downward sloping eyebrows they had, and they elongated the shape and made it come down towards the temple. So this is something that you can definitely do now to make it a little bit more 1920s without having to overpluck or give yourself a black greased eyebrow, which is what they used to do. And of course it's obviously more modern if you have it a little bit more full. Then with mascara, again, mascara is another product that was pretty much invented in the form we know of it today back in the 1920s. It was originally applied as kind of a wax to the eyelashes, but this used to kind of melt and go really, really clumpy, so it would make them look really heavy and spidery. Nowadays, obviously, we don't have that issue, and I used the Hot and Naughty Lash by MAC here for a full effect. So to further brighten up the face and give that really pale light effect, I used a highlighter here. It's a matte highlighter. It's Radiant Rose by MAC. So this I applied underneath the eyes. Again, careful not to go over the shadow that I had applied in the inner corner. And I just made sure to buff this in really well and blend it down into the foundation. I also tapped some of this onto the high points of my face and anywhere else where I wanted a little bit of a highlight. And then using a stiff concealer type brush, I just picked up whatever else was left in the back of my hand and used this to shape that end of my eyebrow to make it a little bit more tapered and neat. And then just to ensure that my face was as flawless as possible, I went in over any red areas with a yellow toned concealer. This is a Bobbi Brown touch-up stick, and buffed this anywhere where there was any kind of redness, anywhere around my nose, any little bumps or lumps or spots on my face. And contouring wasn't really thought of or invented or known of back in the 1920s yet, but I'm just using some of that hollow pigment to very, very naturally contour my nose because it's very, very light. And I also apply a tiny bit of it just underneath my cheekbones to add a little bit of definition back into my face, because using such a light full coverage foundation, it does flatten your features a lot. And then of course Rouge was quite popular back in the 1920s. They'd apply their Rouge cream and then they'd usually go over this with a powder and then they'd finally cover this up with their face powder. So it would have quite a lot of layers and be quite thick, and their foundation definitely wasn't natural, or their makeup wasn't natural looking, but we can make it look natural nowadays. So I just got a cream blusher and I applied this very lightly onto my cheeks, and I also will go over this with the face powder then to settle it back into the skin. The foundation they had back in the 1920s really was just a very thick face powder caked over a kind of a tacky face cream, so luckily we don't have to do that anymore. And then I applied a little bit of a very light contour powder, again just to add a little bit of definition back into my face, just in the very outer half. As usual, before applying any lip products, I start off with my Prep and Prime Lip by MAC, which is a lip primer, and I allow this to go a little bit tacky. It takes about 30 seconds or so just before I apply my lip pencil, which I used Auburn here by MAC, which is a deep red. You could go deeper if you wanted it to be a bit more noir, but I really like this bright red, again keeping it more modern. And then I started to draw in the shape. So the shape of the 1920s was very distinct. It was very rounded. So the way Max Factor, who was obviously huge back in the 1920s, he used to apply 2 prints of his index finger along the top of the lip and 1 swept along the bottom of the lip, given the kind of 2 mounds at the top and the 1 round at the bottom. And one thing that they also used to do was avoid going out to the corners. This was so that it would look a bit more bubbly and it would give more of a fuller lip effect. So I just kind of went for a similar effect, but I did go a little bit closer to the lip corners. And then using Box lipstick by Illamasqua, I pressed this all over where I put my lip pencil using a lip brush and just set all that in place. And there you have it. That's my modern take on the 1920s kind of makeup. So of course, if you want to see the full list of products and see more pictures and stuff, just go to LetzMakeup.com and I'll chat to you all really soon. So long, guys.